Now that we have met the two major types of electoral systems that we have in democracies around the world, we can start thinking about evaluating these. We talked about how we would consider electoral systems as independent variables that cause changes in society, that cause other variables to change, so the dependent variables. And we're going to look at this particularly from the standpoint of quality of democracy. And of course, by that we mean which of these systems is going to better approximate the ideal type of democracy? And that is something that I'm going to ask each of you to sort of formulate in your mind. But as we do that, before we get into the overall, pros and cons of our two systems of single-member district majoritarian electoral laws and proportional representation electoral laws, there are a few more concepts that we're going to need to understand. So let's start with what I think are going to be the hardest concepts for us to grasp, just the logic of these. And that's the idea of wasted votes and the related concept of strategic voting. So a wasted vote is simply any vote that does not get any representation. So if you cast a vote for a party that doesn't get any representation, we're going to call that vote wasted. And to look at how this works, let's think about Ralph Nader, who was a presidential candidate for a third party, the Green Party. And one of his probably most notorious of many runs was his presidential bid in the 2000 presidential election. And so here you can see the states where Nader was on the ballot and got a little bit of support. And Nader ends up winning about a little less than 3% of the popular vote in the 2000 election. Now, of course, we have this very unique electoral system for selecting president in the United States, where most states are an all or nothing district, where most states are going to give all of their electoral college votes to whoever got more votes, a plurality of votes within each of their state, right? So Nader getting, about 3% of the national popular vote is going to get 0% of those electoral college votes. And these are wasted votes. Like I said, wasted votes are those votes that don't get any representation whatsoever. And under these electoral laws, you can imagine Nader getting 5%, 10%, 15%, even 20% of the national vote, and probably not winning a plurality within any state, so not actually getting any electoral college votes, and certainly not becoming president. So again, these are wasted votes. Strategic voting is the related idea that voters know about this. Voters can figure out that their vote will be wasted if they support certain candidates, and so they're going to sometimes vote for, a second choice candidate. They're going to vote for a candidate other than their true preference, whether it's ideologically or what have you, and they're going to do so because they know that those votes could be wasted, and that in wasting their vote, they could be contributing to, their least favored candidate being elected. So the idea here would be, if I am, a Nader voter, I'm a Green voter, but I know that Nader's probably not going to become president, and so I would probably support the Democrat instead of supporting Nader. I know that my vote for Nader would go nowhere, so I'm going to vote for the Democrat in hopes that my second choice favorite, the Democrat, is going to beat, the worst possible outcome for me, the Republican candidate. Indeed, there probably are a lot of Nader voters in 2000 who did regret that, because even though Nader won a very small percentage of the popular vote, that was a very, very close election. And particularly in a place like Florida, a percentage point, remember Nader won about 3%, could have certainly tipped the scales and could have won Al Gore that state and therefore that election. And that's why voters will often act strategically here. They'll think, well, I'm a Green Party voter, so that's what I really want. But the Democratic candidate wouldn't be as bad, whereas the Republican candidate, would be truly abhorrent to me as a Green Party candidate, as a Green Party voter. Now, you could, of course, tell the same story on the other side of the political spectrum. You could think of a Libertarian voter who is not going to cast his or her vote for the Libertarian candidate because they're going to vote strategically. They're going to say, well, I really like the Libertarian ideology the best, but I'm going to support the Republican because the Republican has a real chance of getting elected, and that would be a much better outcome for me as a Libertarian than the Democratic candidate getting elected. That is voting strategically. Again, we see that institutions really affect behavior. Strategic voting is essentially voters reacting to the electoral institutions of their state. Because we have single member districts with plurality rules, we see voters casting their ballots for mainly the two big political parties, because those are the parties that could actually get their vote represented in political circles and in the legislative body and in lawmaking. And that brings us to Duverger's law. Now, Maurice Duverger is a very, very famous French political scientist, and he observed that single-member district systems typically result in fewer parties. Now, it's not always the case that they result in two-party systems, as we have with these two delightful fellows in the United States, but the idea here is simply that because of strategic voting, most voters are going to opt for a major party instead of a smaller party in single-member district systems, and so we're going to end up with fewer parties in single-member districts. Now, the causal mechanism here is that strategic voting that I mentioned. What I mean by a causal mechanism is basically what turns a cause into an effect. When we make a causal statement, such as single-member district institutions cause fewer parties in the party system, causal mechanisms are the reason why. So I would say single-member districts cause fewer parties in the party system because of strategic voting, because voters are reluctant to cast their vote for a candidate that has very little to no chance of actually winning, and so they might actually cast their vote for their second or even third choice in order to prevent, the worst case scenario from playing out. That's strategic voting, and strategic voting is the causal mechanism for Duverger's law because it tells us why this exists. Another causal mechanism with Duverger's law, or the law that single-member districts result in fewer political parties in the party system, is the tactics and strategies that political leaders themselves are going to use. Politicians get into politics because they want to see change, and they want to make change, and they want to be put into those positions of power where they can use the public authoritative decision-making powers of the state to make the changes that they care about. Now, to get into those positions, you have to win elections. And if I'm an aspiring politician, I might not want to join the Libertarian or Green Party in the United States, even if that's really closer to where my ideological convictions are. I might join the Republican or the Democratic Party because the Republican or Democratic Party is going to give me a real opportunity to get into a position of power. Whereas the Green or Libertarian Party might allow me a soapbox, but it's very unlikely, with very few exceptions in this country, that I'm going to win an election of any real significance with anything other than a Republican or Democratic backing. So another concept that we can turn to actually has more to do with proportional representations, and that's the idea of fragmentation. Now, proportional representation systems can be enormously advantageous because they allow for more parties to enter the legislative body. It's sort of the flip side of Duverger's law, that single-member districts provide fewer parties, while proportional representation electoral systems provide room for more parties, right? If you only get 10% of the vote in single-member districts, you're likely going to get 0% of the representation. Well, if you get 10% of the vote in a proportional representation system, you'll likely get somewhere around 10% of the representation, and that can be a really important voice in a legislative body, right? That could be, in some circumstances, the deciding votes on a coalition government or a budget or a really critical law. And so proportional representation systems are going to allow for broader representation, more parties, more ideological perspectives. The flip side of that, though, and so that's the benefit, but the flip side, the disadvantage there, is going to be fragmentation. And by fragmentation, we mean that a legislative body might have more parties and it might have more smaller parties. And that could lead to less stability. It could be really difficult to keep a coalition together. It could be really difficult to pass a law when you have to negotiate with 5, 6, 7, 10 other parties. And so to think about how that plays out, let's look at the example of Israel, and this is the current ruling coalition of Israel, which is a parliamentary system that also has proportional electoral laws without a threshold. And the Israeli legislative body, the Knesset, is actually pretty notorious for having high fragmentation. And so here we can see that Benjamin Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, who's a member of this Likud party, the biggest single party in the Israeli parliament, right? But there are several other parties that he has to deal with, and just to have a governing coalition, he's in a coalition with, look, one, two, three, four, five, a six-party coalition. So he has to sort of keep six different political parties happy in order to maintain that confidence of the parliament in order to get anything done. And that, of course, can be good. It can mean that there's more coalition building and there's more compromise. It could also mean that there is less stability. It certainly is a higher probability that that government would fall than if it were the case that if he just had to worry about only party members of his own party. And indeed, there have been states like Greece in recent memory where there have had to be, multiple elections because there'd be such fragmentation in the legislative body that they couldn't get anything done. They couldn't hold a government together, and then you had long periods of time without a stable governing body, without leadership, and that can be very damaging. To take this to sort of its most dramatic effects, we can look at Germany in the interwar period. So in the interwar period, meaning after World War I, but before World War II. And after World War I, Germany was for a brief time a democracy. This is known as the Weimar Republic. And here you can see the different parties that were represented in the legislative bodies of the German Weimar Democratic Republic. And you can see it had a very high fragmentation. And this level of fragmentation, it seems to increase polarization, cause all sorts of instability, and in the end, it allowed for the Nazi Party to take advantage of this fragmentation and this instability and this uncertainty to take over power, even though, as you can see, they were a small fringe movement. And this is the real scary thing. Of course, the rise of Hitler in Germany is a very, very, very extreme example, but the point stands that there's a lot of fragmentation in certain proportional representation systems. Again, as it was the case with how Duverger's law plays out in the United States with the two-party system, it's not just the electoral systems, but of course electoral institutions are going to interact with other elements of the political regime. So for example, the electoral system is going to interact with the type of executive legislative arrangement that you have. So proportional representation will work out very differently in a parliamentary system like Israel than it would in a presidential system such as Brazil, which has proportional representation but is a presidential democracy. So for our final concept to cover and thinking about the effects of electoral institutions, specifically in regard to how well they approximate the ideal type of democracy, we should look at gerrymandering. And this is a huge issue, and I would bet that a number of you in the class have already heard this term. So what is it exactly? Gerrymandering is simply drawing districts so that they favor one side over the other. And this, of course, is a pretty unique threat with single-member districts. And we see this playing out in the example of where I used to live. Here is where I used to live. I actually lived, let me see, right about here. And when I had Joyce Beatty as my congressperson, and she represented this district, which is all, Columbus, and which is a very, it has a huge university and it's very diverse. It has some lower income places. So Columbus is very, very, very democratic. And indeed, I lived and I had a Democratic representative. But if I'd lived on the other side of the street where I lived, I'd have a different representative. And if I'd lived about, I think it was 7 blocks north of where I lived, I'd have yet another one. And this is because the electoral districts of Ohio are highly, highly gerrymandered. And you can do this by taking a place like Columbus and saying, okay, we're gonna give the Democrats one seat, and then we'll sort of divide up the rest of those Democratic-leaning areas and sort of snatch them up with lots of sort of more rural, right-leaning areas. And so this is sort of how gerrymandering works. And the Republicans actually had control of the Ohio House of Representatives when they redrew the district lines after the 2010 census. But of course, the Democrats have done the same thing in other states. In either way, what this ends up meaning is that elections are not very competitive. And so if you are, Joyce Beatty, you only have to worry about getting the Democratic vote, right? You don't have to worry about about Republicans really at all. And if you are a Republican in a safe Republican district, again, you're not really worried about the general election as much. The other element of this is that it can be very disproportional. And so in Ohio, where Ohio is considered a bellwether, it is very centrist typically. And so in a given election, you'd have Democrats and Republicans getting pretty equal numbers of the votes, though Republicans getting, a slight majority, but their slight majority is translated into an enormous majority, where in the current House of Representatives, Ohio sends 4 Democrats and 12 Republicans. Now, of course, from the 16 potential districts in Ohio, the Democrats got 4 or 25%. They got way more than 25% of the vote. They're getting in the upper 40s for the vote. And so you can see how gerrymandering can cause extreme disproportionality. It can also cause elections to not be as competitive, which can really decrease accountability. All right. So finally, let's just recap. When it comes to single-member districts, good things about them is that they favor majority, so they fight that problem of fragmentation. Typically can get more effective government and more stability. They also offer what's called constituency services, and this is the idea that if in single-member districts, each district is going to have sort of its local politician, its local representative to go to the Capitol. And so here in Colorado, we're in the 3rd district in Durango, and we can call up Scott Tipton, whether we're a Democrat or a Republican or what, and just say, look, I live in your district. I am your constituent, and this is what I think. This is what I care about, right? If you live in multi-member districts, imagine if we lived in a district with 100 different seats, it would be hard to know who to contact, and there wouldn't be this idea of, our local representative. Of course, the con is that these majorities that can cause stability, they can also be quite distorting, and so you can hear people talking about manufacturing majorities, and the high number of votes that can be wasted in these systems. So there can be disproportionality with lots of wasted votes, with manufactured majorities, with parties being really over or really underrepresented represented because of strategic voting or because of gerrymandering. And of course, as we saw with gerrymandering, district boundaries can be highly manipulated. So let's look at the pros of proportional representation. Well, as opposed to single-member districts, proportional representation wastes very few votes, right? You might waste the votes that don't reach the threshold, but typically you're going to represent pretty fairly. But typically, the percentage of votes in the population is translated right into the percentage of seats within the legislative body, which you can see as parties being more fairly represented. This also can encourage more perspectives, more diverse minority viewpoints, for example, because we get around Duverger's law, right? Proportional representation is going to allow more parties into the conversation and into the legislative body. On the flip side, though, there are no constituency services, and so voters don't necessarily have their own specific representative. So we wouldn't, have one person where we could call and say, "Hey, I live in your district. You represent me personally." We'd have to deal with sort of, national level parties, which might be less responsive to our individual and local needs. And then, of course, as we've gone over, they also risk high fragmentation and instability. So as we see, these are complicated institutions, and their effects upon the quality of democracy are also complicated and even contradictory at times. So lots to think about. I look forward to seeing what you think is the most fair system. Get in touch if you have any questions.